And I think deep down it was me trying to make up for what people might have thought about my family. Well, they can't be all bad, can they? Because look what she's doing. So I was, in a sense, focused on achieving and doing well. But at the age of 17, I left home because I just could not stand it anymore being at home. And in my last 2 years at high school, I actually met Alan, my husband. Some of you have met him over the last day or so. And God knows how to help. Because when I was in my teens, I was suicidal. I remember meeting Alan, but not taking a lot of notice of him because I was a prefect at school. Alan says, "Oh, you've always been bossy." But he was just one of the plebs. But it's all right, he says that himself, it's okay. It's not my words, it is. Well, I'm not putting him down. He was wonderful. But I met him, and I think God looked at me and thought, now there's an accident waiting to happen here. I better bring this guy along pretty early. And so we started dating my first year out of high school and got married the next year. So we were pretty young when we were together. We're sort of grown up together. But you know, he comes from a completely different family. His family are Christian people, generations of Christians. They came out from Europe under religious persecution, came out to South Australia, and right from the point of their immigration, refugee status, whatever you want to call it, they believed and followed God right down through the generations. And so I married into a family who believed the Word of God, who lived the Word of God, and it was a completely different circumstance. You know, God has ways of bringing the gaps and the issues in our lives and filling them in some other way. That's the thing about God. He doesn't leave you where you are. Even though you might have trapped in some really challenging places, He doesn't leave you with all those issues. If you're open to change, and if you're open to healing, and if you're open to being strengthened. And for me, God was so gracious. Here, I'd never had a role model of what a husband and wife lived like. I mean, how do you do that? I never had a role model of mothering. My mother was unable to do it, and my stepmother was totally incapable. I never had a role model. How do you make up those gaps? Do you go to school with a book and learn it? No, you learn it by being around people who are living that. And so God was really gracious. When we got married, we hadn't finished our university degrees, so we lived with Alan's parents for the first 12 months. But you know, that was part of God's plan, because I learned what a mother and father did. I learned what a great marriage was like. I learned things like housekeeping and the sorts of things I'd never a clue about, how you cook and do things, and Alan's a good cook, but how you cook and do things. The most amazing thing that God helped make up those nurturing gaps in my life and those learning gaps in my life. So we need to have hope and trust that God knows how to bring even the most practical things into our lives that will fill those voids and those places where perhaps there wasn't the nurturing, there wasn't the love, there were circumstances of trauma or whatever it was in your life. God's able to bring people into our lives to bring healing to our lives, and I'm so grateful for that. And the more I connected with the love of God, the more I recognised how wonderful Jesus Christ was in my life, the more I realised what He'd saved me from, the more I looked at the cross of Calvary and understood His dying for me was the ultimate act of love, the more I recognised how much He had reached out to me and drawn me to Himself and brought me into this place of love, into His world, into His love. And it just began to really transform me and really change me. And so that began for me, as I understood the mercy the Lord had towards me, it began me on a journey of mercy and forgiveness towards my own father. It was a challenging thing. When I got married, my father was pretty tipsy, and we had a very wonky walk down the aisle. And so there were lots of things where he just wasn't there for me, and the whole issue of shame was a big one for me. But, you know, I began to visit my dad again and just show love to him and just spend time with him. I remember he looked at me, and I could tell one day he looked at me and thought, I'm sure he's thinking, what's your angle? What are you here for? And I just wanted to share the love of God with him. But every time I spoke to him about God, he'd yell at me, so I didn't really get very far. He didn't want to hear about it. He had this saying, you don't talk about religion or politics, but he always talked about politics, so I'm not sure about that. But you know, I kept reaching out and loving him, inviting him to our home and just spending time with him and introducing him obviously to our children and him sharing in their world. And there came a time when he rang me up to say he was going away on holidays and he was just saying goodbye. And I said, oh Dad, you're going on a holiday. I'd love to share with you about Jesus and how much he loves you and how much he wants you to be part of his family, and that he died for you to bring you back into his family, and that the family is not just for here and now, but it's for eternity, forever. I thought, oh, he's going to hang up on me. He didn't. He actually said, well, tell me more. So I shared with him how much God loved him and how much if he can give his heart to Jesus and turn from whatever lifestyle and everything that he's been living in, that God would embrace and love him. That there was a gift that's given that you can't earn. And so he took that on board, never said anything, and off he went for his holidays. Actually came to Queensland for his holidays, very good. And I remember there was a phone call one morning, and it was my stepmother ringing to say your father's had a serious heart attack. They don't expect him to live. And so I got in my closet and I prayed and I prayed and prayed like I'd never prayed before in my life. Then we got another phone call the next morning to say, well, he's a little bit better. And then I got another phone call to say he's had another heart attack and they don't expect him to live till morning. So again, I got into my closet and I prayed again and sought the Lord and asked for God to help and to do something special, whatever. I can hardly find words for it now. And so I got another phone call the following day and they said they can't believe it. Your father's sitting up in bed and they say he's going to recover. But God was really good. He spent 3 months up here recovering, came back to Melbourne. And again, I thought, he didn't say anything about what I'd shared with him. And I remember that he didn't really understand the Bible. I remember him saying, I can't understand the Bible. So I bought him a modern translation. I gave it to him for Father's Day, and it was in a brown paper bag. And he looked at it, screwed it up, turned around and walked off. I had no clue what he thought, whether he wanted it or had he thrown it in the bin, whatever. He never said a word. And then about 6 weeks after that event, they called me to say, Helen, we're really, really sorry, but your father has died. I thought, do you ever say this to God? What did you do that for, God? Now, maybe it's just me. But I remember waking up the morning of the funeral saying to God, what did you do that for, God? Because I had this plan. I had this idea that, you know, my father's going to come to the Lord and it's going to be so brilliant and we're going to have this amazing, wonderful relationship and it's all going to be incredibly special and different. And he's dead. What do I do? God spoke to me. He said, my loving kindness is better than life. Straight out of the Word of God, my loving kindness is better than life. Well, I went off to the funeral. I had no idea what had happened to my dad. I didn't know whether he'd gone to heaven to be with the family of God for eternity or he'd gone not to be with the family of God for all of eternity. I had no idea. And so we were actually sitting in the funeral car on the way to the gravesite, and the Baptist minister had taken the service, and he turned around and he said, oh, by the way, Helen, I came down to visit your dad 2 weeks ago and he gave his life to the Lord. So thank you, Lord. Yeah. So God has people everywhere if we're faithful. So that was my dad. And then there were other members of my family. As I said, I came from a totally unchurched background. I had an aunt who was my father's sister, and she was the same. You mentioned God, she'd yell at you. In fact, she'd want to throw things at you and call you names, so that didn't get me very far either. But there came a day, and you know, I treated her a little bit like a mother, because I didn't have a mother, but she wasn't like a mother, but I did that. And she sent me a letter one day, and she said, I never want to see you again as long as I live. Out of the blue. Alan and I were in Bible college at that stage. And then a while later, months later, we got another letter to say, I've been diagnosed with life-threatening terminal cancer and I want to see you. So when we came to visit her, it was like a movie. It was like we turned up in her yard, she ran out, she ran to us, we ran to her. It was like, oh, it was like a movie. It was just amazing. And over that period of her illness, the only person she wanted to sit by her bed and share the love of God with her and the Word of God was Alan and me. She wanted to know. She was hungry to know. And so she had given her life to the Lord and before she died, 3 months later. And then her husband, who again was pretty turned off to God, he gave his life to the Lord. And he was an American. And he lived in Australia, and he was a member of the Australian American Association, and he led many, many of his colleagues to the Lord. So God brought my father, myself, my father, my aunt, my uncle. Now my sister is a Christian, married to a Christian. My brother's a Christian. And God took our lives and turned a whole generation around for him. Our kids are all Christians, married to Christians. My grandkids go to Christian schools, and it's just a story of God's redemption and restoration. Now, regardless of where you've been, regardless of the trauma and challenge that you've had in your life, healing and restoration are totally possible. God showed me his love. And over the years where I was actually living at home and really struggling with staying there, I'm so grateful I stayed there, because it's meant that I've been able to study for a number of things, and that's been my calling in life. And God's taken my life, my story, and he's taken my training, and he's really used it for his purposes. And that's why I'm passionate about what I do. I've seen the work of Jesus Christ firsthand in my own family, in my own life. And I've experienced the love of God, the love of the Father, and I've seen it in the lives of so many people, both here in Australia and beyond, as God takes hold of lives and brings healing, because that's his heart and that's his promise. And it says in verse 7, then will the burning sands become a pool. This is Isaiah 35 again. That was the promise he gave. The thirsty ground and bubbling springs. And for me, it's been such a privilege to develop some of these courses we've developed out of our church that touched our local community, that have now gone all over the world. We've had 100,000 men do Valiant Men through Australia, and then they're translated into Russia. They're all over the old Russian countries. There's 5 of them translated into Russian. Valiant Man's translated into Indonesian, translated into German. Search for Life's translated into German. The trainings, facilitator small group trainings translated into German. Search for Life's translated into French. Valiant Man's translated into Swahili. You never know where it ends up. And we're currently translating the training into Mandarin. So God has had his way. Okay. It's a privilege. And when I stand here today, I can say, yes, it's difficult to go through those challenges, but I thank God for every single thing that he's brought me through. And I can stand here today and say, I'm grateful to the Lord. I have seen Jesus open blind eyes where we just can't see things. I've seen him unstop the ears of the deaf where we just can't hear things. And I've seen him turn all these broken lives around. And here's a couple of stories I just wanted to share with you of people who've done some of the courses. And her name was Anne, and she's given me permission to share this. She did our program called Search for Life, and this is how she described herself. She said, I was experiencing terrible loneliness and isolation and a pervasive sadness in me. No matter how hard I tried to perform and live a good Christian life, I couldn't find the sense of security, value and love I craved. Relationships were really difficult. My whole life has been driven by chaotic, emotional swings, fear, guilt, shame, outbursts of uncontrollable and misplaced anger. And this is what she said about how the Lord brought healing as she was doing that Search for Life course. She said, it was like a light going on. At last, I began to understand why I constantly felt the way I did. There were times when participating in those groups, I didn't want to return the following week to face the often raw pain. My natural instinct screamed to self-protect and run away, but to what? I stayed and learned to love God, others and myself in a healthy way. I've gained keys and insights to develop these qualities. I've learned to let go of my bitterness and unforgiveness. I've discovered that my choices make a difference to those